Skunk water is a chemical water with a bad smell.
What ends up happening is you have over 100,000 anti-fascists, Jews, immigrants, and other people block the march route. The 6,000 fascists that show up can't even take a few steps.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Struggle is shown on cable stations from Maine, Vermont, down to New York City. Our website, thestruggle.org. The Israelis killed their first Palestinian of the year, Musab al-Tamimi. You may remember that name. He's related to the family that's leading resistance in Nabi Saleh. Corporate news says he was killed in clashes. When you hear that word clashes, realize that's Israeli propaganda. It usually means there was an Israeli raid and people either resisted or ran away. Musab al-Tamimi was reportedly either shot in the neck or in the back of the head. His brave cousin Ahed Tamimi was charged with 5 counts of assault and various other security offenses. She's facing years in prison. Her immense crime was to slap an Israeli soldier. Last week we talked about the enormous hypocrisy about this, showing video from the Israeli group B'Tselem of an Israeli soldier punching a blindfolded Palestinian prisoner. Of course, he will get no punishment for his act against the blindfolded prisoner. Now, the Israeli paper Haaretz went at it another way, talking about the contrast in treatment for an Israeli settler, a Jew, who slapped an Israeli soldier. Her name is Yafat al-Kobi. She slapped and scratched a soldier. She's earlier been convicted of 5 crimes, never faced anything but token punishment. This is how Israeli apartheid works. Here is our video from 2015. Musab Tamimi, Ahed's father, talking about another noxious Israeli practice, spraying skunk water directly into people's homes in Nabi Saleh.
Skunk water is a chemical water with a bad smell, which remain on the ground for 2 weeks. You can't smell it. It's kind of like the skunk. And they use it every Friday, and they come and shoot it inside the houses. And it's remained for a long period of time. They shoot it inside the houses, which make more furniture roses, and use this, and so a lot of people burn their furniture. It's make cancer when it comes to the body, a lot of times. For example, they shoot it on my wife 1 week. It's remain in her hair for 2 or 3 weeks. You can't smell it. This is the skunk water, and they target also the tanks for storing water to make it more difficult. Yeah.
Here is some of the video he showed us.
This is the skunk water.
And it breaks the windows.
It's broke the windows, yes. You see this? It broke the house.
Here's that video directly from Middle East Monitor. Notice there was nothing going on. The Israeli soldiers were not breaking up a mob of Palestinians with guns, knives, or even stones. Nothing was happening, and yet these soldiers were breaking windows and spraying this horrible skunk right into people's homes. By the way, the Israeli government is starting to use skunk water against Jews, against Orthodox Jews in Israel who refuse to be drafted into the Israeli army and demonstrate about it. To see the video, Google skunk Israel ultra-Orthodox. Go to the website RPM.world. On Sunday, the 7th of January, there's a Day of Rage for Syria. There's news about it there. Also, a new pamphlet about political prisoners in Syria, Egypt, Iran, and Palestine. Last week, we presented the first part of the talk by Mark Bray about his book, Antifa, a discussion of tactics used against fascists and Nazis. Lo and behold, Congressman Keith Ellison tweeted, "I just found a book that strikes fear in the real Donald Trump." For this tease, Ellison got a ton of nasty reactions from haters and mad conspiracists. They attacked him for supporting the supposed Antifa terrorist group. Problem is, there is no such group. More from Mark Bray.
When Hitler took power in 1933, the slogan of the German Communist Party was "First Hitler, then us," by which they meant they thought Hitler would get into power, he would do such a terrible job governing that 6 months or 9 months later, he'd be out and the communists could ride in on his coattails to a successful government. Of course, that isn't what happened, but it shows you that it wasn't until much later that some European left leaders took the threat of fascism seriously. This, of course, is very different from how your rank-and-file socialists or communists understood the threat during this period, because at a local level, when communists were invading left taverns or union offices or political party offices or neighborhoods, the rank-and-file was much more eager to countenance militant defensive strategies in their leadership, which is another important dynamic in this. Perhaps the first significant example of a kind of awareness of the existential threat of fascism can be found in 1934, when the Austrian socialists rose up against the right-wing government. That same year, a right-wing government was gained power in the Spanish Republic in Spain, and there was a miners' uprising in Asturias. Their slogan was "Better Vienna than Berlin," because in Vienna, the socialists rose up, in Berlin they didn't. So there's starting to be an awareness that this is a threat, and I think that really leads into the Spanish Civil War, where you finally have kind of an anti-fascist domino theory. If we don't stop fascism in Spain, it will threaten the entire continent, the entire world. And of course, that is what happened. A lot to say about the Spanish Civil War. I'll just limit it to a few remarks. This, at least on the surface, was of course the greatest moment of interwar anti-fascist unity, where at least for a brief period of time, all of the left lined up to oppose Franco and his allies in Hitler and Mussolini. Within less than a year, however, that artificial or superficial unity fragmented along one main divide, which, oversimplistically put, is on one side you had anarchists, Trotskyists, and other anti-authoritarians who argued for pursuing the social revolution in tandem with fighting fascism. On the other side, you had the majority of socialists and communists who argued for putting the class struggle aside for the moment in the interest of fighting the war. And that's split the coalition apart, and the left lost the Spanish Civil War. But here we have an image of the Tom Mooney Company from the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, and certainly the international brigades that journeyed from around the world to fight against fascism are an enduring image and legacy of anti-fascism. Before we go to the post-war period, I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about London and the Battle of Cable Street. So here we have some images from 1936. The Battle of Cable Street was, in short, a situation where the very anti-Semitic British Union of Fascists planned to march through the largely Jewish East End of London. Interestingly enough, when this march was proposed, the Communist Party of Great Britain denounced efforts to plan a militant counter-protest. They thought that would be disorderly and uncivil. So the Communist Party of Great Britain instead urged their members to attend a protest in support of the Spanish Republic at a different place at the same time in London. Their rank and file complained, especially their Jewish members, and so the party reversed course, but it shows you that the debate over should we ignore them, should we confront them, goes far back. What ends up happening is you have over 100,000 anti-fascists, Jews, immigrants, and other people block the march route. The 6,000 fascists that show up can't even take a few steps. The police shut down the event, and the battle that occurs is really between the anti-fascists and the police. After the event, if you read the British newspapers the next day, Oswald Mosley and his fascists complained that this anti-fascist demonstration impeded their, quote, free speech. So that argument goes back 100 years and has been used by fascists under different circumstances. So when we understand the post-war period, I think it's important to see how post-war militant anti-fascism drew on some of the interwar history to organize their strategy and tactics. So in the book, I have a chapter, 5 Lessons from History for Anti-Fascists, and I'll just talk about a couple of them. One of them is, I already kind of alluded to. Oops, foreshadowing. Mussolini started out with 100. When Hitler attended his first meeting of the German Workers' Party before the name changed to the Nazi Party, the party had 54 members. And so post-war anti-fascists have argued that if you look at the roots of fascism, it often grows from small groups. And so it's important to take them seriously when they're small, when it's easier to organize against them than when they're large. More recently, we can see that similar events have happened in Greece, where the fascist Golden Dawn was a micro-party for decades before becoming the 3rd largest party in Greece after the 2008 financial crisis. So it can happen. And my conversations with Greek anti-fascists after 2008, where they were kicking themselves for not taking it more seriously earlier, made it very clear to me that this lesson still applies. The other thing that they argue, though, is not only that there's a threat that these small fascist groups could take over governments or create mass movements, because sometimes that happens, but a lot of the times it doesn't. The other argument that post-war anti-fascists have made is that even in small doses, this can be very dangerous. We can even see, just to talk about current events, over the weekend there was a White Lives Matter demonstration in Tennessee, and an interracial couple was assaulted later that evening by white supremacists who had attended. When Richard Spencer spoke at the University of Florida, neo-Nazis opened fire with firearms on counter-demonstrators. There's Heather Heyer in Charlottesville. The list goes on and on. So even in small doses, it's a dangerous situation and ought to be taken seriously. The other argument they made is that, or I made, that people should take into account, I'm sure someone else has made it, but I don't know for sure, is that to some extent, part of the reason why a lot of anti-fascist leadership in the 20s and 30s didn't take it seriously enough is they sort of assumed that fascism was just another wrinkle on traditional conservative right-wing politics that they had seen throughout the 19th century. So if you read some writers in the 20s, they sometimes compare the fascists to the white guards in Russia, to the black and tans in the British Isles. And so in that way, they didn't realize that fascism and Nazism represented an existential threat. They thought it was essentially the kind of back and forth pendulum of revolution and reaction that they had seen, the repression of the Paris Commune, the repression of the 1905 Russian Revolution, and so forth, but this represented something different. For that reason, I think it's important to always assess changes in far-right politics and never assume it's monolithic and never changing. The other thing they concluded is that the liberal prescription for stopping the far right didn't work. So what does that entail? I think it entails three main things. The first is faith in reasoned dialogue to stop fascist ideas, faith in the police to stop fascists when they do something illegal, and faith in parliamentary government to stop the creation of a fascist regime. But in important situations, those three failed. We can see that plenty of arguments were made against fascism and Nazism in the interwar period that didn't successfully stop them. We can see that when you try to argue with people who reject the terms of debate, who reject rationality, who reject the humanity of many of the people making the argument, then more needs to be done than talking. Likewise, the police were among those most sympathetic to the quote-unquote return to law and order promise of fascism. More recently, we can see that in France with the Front National and in Greece with the Golden Dawn, the police voted for these far-right parties in greater percentages than the general population. And of course, there are all sorts of other reasons to be skeptical of an institution that has roots in a white supremacist history. And then in terms of parliamentary government, I think there's this kind of lazy assumption that liberal democracy is the antithesis of fascism without seeing how Mussolini and Hitler were both appointed. They attained power largely legally, and when Hitler centralized power with the Enabling Act, that was approved by Parliament. And so it shows that in a lot of cases, liberal democracies have clauses on the books that allow for the centralization of power in times of crisis. And so certainly, if you want to look at it from kind of an anti-capitalist perspective, the times when this was used was when the ruling class felt sufficiently threatened by the left to turn to extra normal methods, but yet methods that were still part of the constitution or the parliamentary process. So for that reason, anti-fascist revolutionaries are skeptical of allowing legality to stop fascism when fascism rose legally. So with those things in mind, let's jump to the post-war period. So Britain's an interesting case to look at because more than other European countries, there's a real continuity in the anti-fascist struggle. Right after World War II, the governments that emerged out of the ashes of the war in both the East and West in Europe fashioned themselves as officially anti-fascist institutions. It's true in Italy, France, Germany. Even the original name of the Berlin Wall was the Anti-Fascist Defensive Barrier, because the Soviet satellites argued that the West was not really denazified and therefore still fascist, but that's another conversation. So they established themselves as officially anti-fascist institutions, and so their solution for stopping the rise of the far right was to make it illegal. So it was in Italy or Germany to create another fascist or Nazi party in the post-war period was against the law. This was also the period of the height of the electoral success of European communist parties. Never had they done as well as in the late 40s, never have they done as well subsequently, because they gained a lot of popularity and support from fighting fascism. And so the argument put forward by most continental European socialist and communist parties was, let's use legislation, let's use the state to make the far right illegal. This was very different in Britain, though, where the sort of tradition of political civil liberties was more broad and less restricted. So basically, right when the war ended, the fascists who were organizing this demonstration came right back out of their holes and started organizing a campaign against Jews again. They attempted to burn down synagogues, they put up posters, war on the Jews, started all over again. And that led to the creation of the 43 group, which was composed of Jewish, British veterans from World War II who came home from the war only to find that in their eyes they had to fight another war. Moving into the 50s and 60s, the target of the far right shifted from trying to attack Jews to focusing a lot more on new waves of migration from the Caribbean and South Asia. So the National Front, which was a fascist party, organized a Keep Britain White campaign that culminated in a march through a Caribbean neighborhood. It was called an anti-mugging march, so you can see the politics of that. And that created or led to the Battle of Lewisham in 1977, which was sort of a sequel to the Battle of Cable Street, where the local Caribbean community, anti-fascists, feminists, leftists, you name it, came up and physically blocked the National Front and successfully prevented them from trying to intimidate this community in the future. It's also important to note the kind of cultural dynamic, because here, of course, you have the rise of punk, and as this kind of music was getting going, the National Front and other fascists tried to infiltrate skinhead culture to create a neo-Nazi skinhead wave. For those who don't know, skinhead culture was originally anti-racist, the product of kind of a cultural mixing between Jamaican culture and music and British working class culture in the late 60s created skinhead culture, but by the end of the 70s there were neo-Nazi skinheads. And so the Anti-Nazi League, which was created by the Socialist Workers' Party, was one of the main formations. And here you have kind of a reimagining of the socialist arrows from earlier. So these three arrows are kind of reimagined in the 70s as a single or double arrow. And they helped to create the Rock Against Racism concert series, which was especially important in pushing back against efforts by neo-Nazi skinheads to recruit and, win over working class youth. Historians, and so in that Rock Against Racism, you've got bands like The Clash, X-Ray Specs, Steel Pulse, The Specials, playing, and historians of music credit Rock Against Racism for being the first time that the white British society came into significant contact with Jamaican music. So, very influential. There are also Rock Against Racism concert series organized in the US and Canada in the 80s and 90s. And then in response, the far right tried to organize Rock Against Communism. It never really got going. The slogan of Rock Against Racism was NF, which stood for National Front. NF equals no fun. So I think when we think about anti-fascist organizing, it's not just a question of politics, it's also a question of culture and socialization. This organizing led to the creation of Anti-Fascist Action in 1985. Here we can see one of their periodicals and the growth of the slogan, no platform, as in no platform for fascism. Excuse me, we can talk about what that means later. And then also on the right, you'll see the importance of IRA solidarity for British anti-fascists. A main reason for this is that the British fascists were really into Ulster loyalism, and so Irish republicanism was identified with the anti-fascist cause. The two main kind of threads, though, I think to understand in post-war European anti-fascism are the British thread and then also the German thread. So here we have some German autonomous anti-fascists in the late 1980s, I believe, organizing a march in memory of an anti-fascist named Connie who was killed when the police chased her out in front of a car that killed her. So here you have the origin of the black bloc street tactic, which, as a quick summary, is essentially a way for people to engage in militant activities under a kind of veil of anonymity by dressing uniformly in black and covering their faces. There are sort of precedents to this kind of street militancy in other countries during the era, but in its sort of fully culminated aesthetic can be dated to the 1980s in Germany with the German autonomous movement. The autonomous movement didn't start to fight fascism. It started to participate in the squatting movement, to organize against nuclear power plants, to fight back against the police, all sorts of things. But by the end of the 80s, its attention was turned largely to resisting a resurgent far-right wave in Germany that was emboldened by the fall of the Berlin Wall and a broader wave of ultranationalism that led towards German reunification. So during this period, you have the influence of the British neo-Nazi skinhead movement. You have a lot of resentment and anti-communism in the East, and cultural tensions with reunification. And so this leads to attempts to burn down refugee centers. A member of the American Olympic bobsled team was assaulted by a neo-Nazi. Amnesty International issues a report condemning the inactivity of the German government. So really these neo-Nazis were allowed to run roughshod over German society, and the autonomous anti-fascists were among the main street presence to organize against them. So in, I think it was 1989, there was a neo-Nazi demonstration planned in front of the German parliament to honor the birthday of Hitler. And these folks were the folks that showed up to physically shut it down. some of the early German Antifa groups, and the use of the term Antifa really, I think, derives from the German case, because in Britain, more often in the 80s and 90s, it was referred to as AFA, for anti-fascist action. It wasn't until the last decade in Britain that the term Antifa was used more, in part because of political cultural influences from Germany. So that term really dates from Germany, and some of the late 80s, early 90s Antifa groups were organized by Turkish migrants for self-defense against neo-Nazis. So you can see in this periodical that it was published in German and Turkish. Here also we have a reimagining of the anti-fascist flags. So in the top right you have the flags from the early 30s, which were both red, and the first example I could find of a black flag included is from December 1987, to show the influence of anarchism in the anti-fascist movement. Also, what's interesting, at least for me, probably only for a handful of you, but I'm going to go on nevertheless, is the orientation of the flag is from left to right, still as it was in the 30s, but within a couple of years it's turned the other way around.
Resistance to fascism is common sense and essential. Correct tactics, of course, are debatable. Fascism, Nazism, leads just one way to war: civil war or world war. A tiny example comes from Austria, which now has the ultra-right in its government. The first baby born in Vienna was a Muslim, and a portion of the social media in that country went crazy with nasty comments, including some calling for the baby's death. Thankfully, people are resisting the savagery. Klaus Schwertner, Secretary General of the Vienna chapter of the Roman Catholic charity Caritas, talked about it on his Facebook page. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I am Stanley Heller for The Struggle.